Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Greetings to you all from wherever you join us today. It's my pleasure to moderate this important discussion on the engagement of Japan across the continent under the banner of Asia Undercurrent. The topic of the day is co-creation of innovative solutions with Africa. This comes in the aftermath of TICAD 9 that happened in Yokohama. We know that this is the season of summitry. It's not a new season, but it's a season that has been expanding. We have FOCAC, we have French Africa Summit, we even have a couple of US Africa Summit happened. Japan has been engaging Africa for a long time, but that also has been waning in so many ways. Several years ago, in the 70s and the 80s, Japan was heavily involved in mining in places like the Democratic Republic of Congo, then Zaire. My name is Mvemba Phezo Dizolele. I'm a lecturer in African Studies at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies in Washington, D.C. As Japan has shifted its own engagement in Africa, we look at the Tokyo International Conference on African Development as a benchmark, if you will, to see how Japan fits in the global power or middle power competition that we find ourselves in today. To discuss this, to get the details on how this engagement affects society, how it affects the economy, how it affects peace and security across the continent. We know this is a continent that is also, while it presents a lot of opportunities, it's a continent that also has its own challenges. And how do we engage effectively so this yield the result that is beneficial on both sides? In other words, what I'll call win-win. We know that Japan is engaging Africa with a new nomenclature where they say we don't want to made in Japan, what we want it to be made with Japan. And it's exactly where Africa stands today in terms of transfer of knowledge, transfer of technology, but also of ideas. What does that mean for a country like Japan with great tradition of strong management, strong democracy? How do you transfer those kind of values to society that have their own values but are looking to move forward? So we know, for instance, that this context is very important because there is also an element of African agency. Where does African agency do this? Where does it meet and where does it fit? Japan today, when we talk about African issues or African challenges, Japan is also a donor country, is a debtor country. Africa owes Japan $4.5 billion. Where does that stand? These are some of the issues that I'd like to tackle today. We have aligned a great panel here with our distinguished expert, which I will introduce. Professor Scarlett Cornelissen, who is with the Department of Political Science at Stellenbosch University and director of the Stellenbosch University Japan Center, a research centers on Africa's international political economy and the region's relations with Asia. She was Catherine Hampson-Bessel Fellow at the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Studies at Harvard University and Leibniz Professor at Leibniz University. We also have with us Mr. Shigeki Komatsubara, who is the resident representative of the United Nations Development Program in the United Republic of Tanzania, where he's joining us from. Before this role, he served as the Director of AI, Country Oversight and Support Team at Regional Bureau for Africa at UNDP headquarters in New York. He's also has been an advisor and represented the UN, an advisor on TICAD and represent the UN in Malawi. Finally, last but not least, is Mr. Amit Jain, who's the director of the NTU SBF Center for African Studies in Singapore and sits on the Continental Supervisory Board of Solidaridad Asia. He's considered a thought leader on the contemporary economic transformation of Africa and its growing multi-sector partnership with Asia. Before this appointment as the director of the Center for African Studies, Amit ran a private sector practice advising clients and investors on how to navigate frontier markets across Asia Pacific and Africa. Without further ado, I'd like to turn to our panel. Again, welcome our distinguished panelists, and Professor Cornelissen will go to you. 6 minutes for you.
Thank you very much, Chair. So as you've introduced, I research about Africa, Asia, with a specialization on Japan's involvement and engagement with the African continent. And perhaps I'm a bit of a veteran observer of the Japan-Africa relationship. I've been following Japan's official development assistance, its development cooperation with Africa, and its diplomacy with Africa for the past 3 decades. So my remarks are from this perspective as an African scholar, Africa-based, that researches about the Japan-Africa relationship. I would like to do 3 things. The first is to reflect on the key milestones, as far as I see, as regards Japan's development cooperation relationship with the African continent. It's a relationship that spans 6 decades. Second, I would like to reflect on the TICAD process. TICAD stands for the Tokyo International Conference on African Development. I would like to reflect a little bit about the whole TICAD process and the whole TICAD system, rather than just on the most recent TICAD gathering that just completed in Yokohama a couple of weeks ago. And the third thing I would like to do then is to reflect on some of the major outcomes of the most recent TICAD, which was TICAD 9, and to consider some of the opportunities, the priorities and imperatives, and lastly, some of the potential risks that there are going forward in the Japan-Africa relationship. So let me start with the first focus in terms of what have been the milestones as far as Japan's development cooperation relationship with Africa has been. This is a long-standing relationship. Not many people are aware of it. It started back in 1966 officially. This year it's 59 years of Japan's development cooperation or official development assistance with the African continent. And it's a relationship that has deepened in trust and reciprocity. Also, Japanese development support for the African continent over this period has been wide-ranging, but it has also increased in diversity over the years. So development support spans different economic sectors and modalities. It's inclusive of large-scale support for large-scale infrastructure development on the African continent, inclusive of support for social sectors, health, education, water, sanitation in Africa, and so forth. There's also been, more recently, the rise of blended finance coming from the Japanese private sector and other actors, which has been a way for the Japanese private sector to advance into Africa's political economy. And then the last aspect maybe to highlight is that this development cooperation has had a clear normative foundation. It's been norm-based. Japan has been promoting partnering with Africa since the inception of its aid program. It has been promoting African ownership of Africa's development since the inception, or at least for a significant part of Japan providing development assistance to Africa. And quality is another norm or value that stands out in this development cooperation relationship. So TICAD then, and the TICAD system, can be considered as an important innovation. When it was first launched in 1993, it was unique and a significant innovation for its time, but it has now become a centerpiece of Japan and Africa's diplomacy. It has grown in relevance, in efficiency, and in impact. And as far as I have seen, TICAD has always been able to capture and respond to the reigning zeitgeist and challenges of the time. Also, under the later leadership of Japan, TICAD has progressively started to draw the attention of Japan's private sector. And there's been a bigger emphasis in promoting private sector engagement between Africa and Japan. So what are the key takeaways then in terms of the patterns in Japan-Africa relations over time? I see two important aspects. First of all, there have been shifts in emphasis by both parties that had been in response to changing foreign policy conditions, both in Japan and also on the African continent. And secondly, especially relevant for the context now, the substantive grounds for the Japan-Africa relationship are changing within the context of a changing geopolitical environment. Given this, a major focal point for both sides, both for Japan and Africa, should be the question of how to craft the relationship from its traditional foundation of a donor-recipient relationship to one of partnership that is fit for purpose in the unfolding geopolitical order, and one perhaps that functions on the basis of strategic cooperation or strategic partnership, and we could talk about the detail of that. So common for both sides then is a comprehensive and proactive security agenda, inclusive of energy security, food security, and climate change resilience. And the TICAD 8 agenda has started to address this in some way. And we can talk about how that, what the mechanisms are that have been introduced, for example, to accelerate the structural transformation of Africa towards a decarbonized economy. TICAD 9, which my colleagues will also speak to, the outcomes of TICAD 9, at least as articulated in the Yokohama Declaration, largely build on some of the joint objectives that were set at TICAD 8. But what stands out for me with TICAD 9 is that there's a decided decisiveness in tone in terms of governance issues, global governance issues, and also in terms of the geopolitical order and world that we today face and the risks that this geopolitical environment poses to us. I'll end off very, very quickly with a reflection on three things: opportunities, imperatives, and then risks. So opportunities, Africa is expected to, its population is expected to grow significantly. By 2050, when the global population reaches 9 billion, 1 in 5 of that would be on the African continent. But if we are going to capitalize on this demographic dividend, we need skills enhancement, we need education. Those are crucial to get a society, the type of society that we want. Secondly, imperatives, just very, very briefly. 2, yes, co-create and co-innovate with Japan towards a future that we want, but for mutual benefit. In other words, addressing the asymmetries in bargaining power that Africa still faces. Lastly, the risks. The risks are manifold. I want to put the spotlight on one, and that's in the health and social sectors, with cuts that we had seen being made by other major powers to support African health systems, and the risk, for example, that poses on a re-emergence of a HIV/AIDS crisis on the continent. Thank you, Chair. I'll end off there.
Thank you very much, Scarlett. Before we go to Shigeki, I would just like to remind our audience that if you're watching us from the Nikkei channel or YouTube Live and you need to submit a question, please scroll down on your screen to find the link that is required for you to submit your questions. We look forward to engaging with you on the other side of these presentations. Shigeki, to you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for this great occasion. I've been working for United Nations Development Program for the past 22 years, but I've been working for Japanese CEOs as economist at the Japan Federation of Economic Organizations. So my perspective kind of combines one from international organizations, maybe one from business. So let me provide my quick take on how I see TICAD. First, there's really kind of common misunderstanding on what TICAD is. It's like bilateral forum, one of many, to discuss ODAs. So let me debunk the myth to start with. What TICAD is not. First, TICAD is not bilateral forum. It is multilateral platform to discuss Africa's development. And that's the reason why United Nations, including UNDP, has been co-organizing TICAD as a process in addition to the summit since its beginning. So first, it is not bilateral place to discuss Japan-Africa ODA. Number two, it's not really about ODA. Of course, for Japan, this is the framework to engage with Africa. But if you look at TICAD, what is being discussed, it is really about Africa's development, supported by international community. And this development discourse, TICAD has been really leading the way. You take a look at the TICAD declarations. They were always a bit half step ahead of the game. Their recommendation was almost copy and paste into MDGs. Their recommendation was almost halfway to SDGs. And then they are the one to come up with a concept which is now common of African ownership and international partnership. And we created so many important perspectives like human-centered development, human security. So as you can see, TICAD has been really always leading the global discourse on African development with Africa at the center. And there's no such multilateral platform which has been really promoting the narrative ahead of the time, which will be reflected in United Nations, which will be reflected in other spaces and fora. Number three, therefore, TICAD is not about negotiation. It is about discussion, consensus building, partnership building, and then multiplying the voice of Africa. And that's the reason why the basic tone and the approach of TICAD is international partnership and African ownership. So looking at TICAD from those perspectives, that's why as UN, we are very, very appreciative of this forum because there's no such other forum to really bring together all different participants, Africa, Japan, Asia, international organizations, civil society, you name it. There's no such forum like this, and we are very, very grateful and also very keenly aware of the very important role it has played for Africa and for global development discourse. Looking at it from there, TICAD 9, I participated for the first time as general audience because I have been managing and working on TICAD for 5, 6, 7. It was an amazing experience for me. And I think this TICAD may have opened a new horizon for Africa's development. Let me explain quickly. Tanzania, I can see, is growing really nicely. It's doubling the economy in 10 years. Its population reached 100 million, maybe 12, 13 years. And it is going into middle income. And the 75% of the population is below 35. Tanzania is emerging as a market, maybe a linchpin of East Africa and Southern Africa, and the economic power on its own. You look at TICAD, what is discussed about this economic partnership. That was so, so important from my point of view. But Tanzania is not only growing on its own, of course. And as I take a look from Tanzania abroad, what really strike me is Tanzania and East Africa really engaging, not only in Africa, but also beyond Africa, especially with Asian economies. For example, usually out of top 5 investors to Tanzania, 3 are always from the Asia, China, India, and Mauritius. And then sometimes Indonesia comes up, sometimes other countries comes up. It is very clear for Tanzania's growth, people, technology, money, and others are coming from the East, and there's so much, in a way, value created around the Indian Ocean and beyond. So Tanzania is already looking beyond the continent and engaged with Asia very strategically. In the past 2 years, President, Vice President, Prime Ministers visited India, Indonesia, Korea, China, Japan. So you can see where Tanzania is looking at its future. Number 3, if we take a look at Asia and Africa, actually, and you take a look at the future projections provided by IMF and others, it is very clear that Asia and Africa would be leading the economic growth in the as global south. So you look at Tanzania on its own, or Tanzania in Africa, or Tanzania with Asia and East Africa in a way, as an engine of the future global south. It was so strategic in a way that this TICAD 9 identified the idea of Indian Ocean Economic Zone. And I think that is very, very uniquely TICAD, because we are supporting Africa, but Africa's reality, and especially socio-economic construct of development, is going beyond borders, going beyond geographic confines, and they're increasing connected between Asia and Africa and other regions. So talking about TICAD, really promoting both areas, will be very epoch-making for the future of both Africa and Asia. And I hope, actually, this TICAD 9 would serve as another opportunity to really create a new horizon for Africa's continuous development, of course, as well as really the future of the global south, promoting better collaboration, business relationship between Asia and Africa. I stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Shigeki. Just to recap, between you and Scarlett, what I've heard is Japan has been engaged for a long time, since 1966, long term, but also they've scaled up what the engagement is. It's also, they've also insisted on that to be bottom up. So that's on the side of Scarlett, the shift that we've seen in emphasis over time, the changing geopolitical engagement, the needs, tremendous needs in the energy sector, food security, energy security, climate change as well, climate degradation, everything that we know. But the risk and the opportunity that this presents, I'll come back to that as we engage in our discussion. Shigeki, from your side, you have fleshed out the confusion or misunderstanding that may exist on what TICAD is or is not. That is not just about ODA, but it's about partnership, and particularly within the context of African development, how it's been forward-looking and having influence and impact the SDG, and before that the MDGs. But it's not necessarily about negotiation, but about consensus and partnership and this new horizon that you're thinking about. Amit Jain, as you join us, I'd like you to, as you make your remark, also to tell us a little bit about how the global power competition, the great power competition, is playing into this. Africa, of course, has always been the frontier. For the last 500 years, nothing major has happened in the world without the input of Africa in one way or another. Recently, though, the scramble for natural resources is something that we cannot not discuss today. I said early in my remarks that Japan had been involved in places like DRC in mining. Japan has shifted to the point that Scarlett was making earlier. But we cannot talk about any engagement, whether it's FOCAC, whether it's France, Africa Summit, whether it's all the other plethora of summitry that exist in the world, and not discuss this. Please.
Thank you. At the NTU SPF Center for African Studies, we happen to be the only think tank in Southeast Asia that looks at Africa from a business, trade, and investment perspective. So that's our unique selling proposition. So from my vantage point here in Singapore, it is remarkable to see how Africa is increasingly becoming central in the economic and foreign policies of Asian countries. I'm sure many of those attending the webinar today may have read about how China is constructing roads, rails, and bridges all over Africa. They may even be aware of Chinese investments in African mining and how Beijing now controls the supply of critical raw materials that you just referred to in making those batteries that go into our phones. They may even have read about Chinese loans having tipped African countries into a debt trap. That, by the way, is a myth. It's not true. What is true, however, is that China does have strategic interest in Africa, but it's not the only one. In the past decade, past decade has seen a surge of strategic of investments and deal making by the likes of India, Japan, UAE, Turkey, Russia, and even Indonesia. Just 2 weeks ago, we had the Africa-Singapore Business Forum in Singapore. More than 700 delegates attended it. For the first time ever, a head of state attended it, President John Mahama of Ghana. That same week, the Confederation of Indian Industry, an industry body, was hosting the India-Africa Conclave in New Delhi. At the same time, that event drew over 1,600 delegates, right? And days earlier, Japan held the 9th Tokyo International Conference on African Development, TICAD. And so it's interesting that the theme that India held, the India-Africa Conclave, was on co-creating a shared future. That sounds a lot like the co-creation and co-designing and co-ownership that Tokyo talks about at TICAD. African leaders are now flying more frequently to Beijing, New Delhi, and Tokyo than they do to Washington, D.C., London, or Paris. So Africa is being quoted by Asia, but the question is why? And this is where I answer your question, Professor Mvemba. It is minerals. Is it market? Is it influence? This is something worth pondering. In this game of great power politics, the lead actors on the stage may be changing, but the script of the drama remains the same. One which is locked in a perpetual state of dependence on its natural resources and external finance, and the other in the position of domination. So Japan's approach to co-creating solutions with Africa at TICAD 9 is therefore a refreshing strategy. But it should be more than just lip service. It should mean what it says. And that's broadly my opening statement. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Amit. I think you are focused on trade and how the increased engagement of Asia with Africa raises its own set of questions. Are we just paying lip service? Are we actually engaging in ways that benefit both sides? The proceedings that you have described, the trade mission, President Mahama of Ghana attending, says quite a bit about this. So Scarlett, I'll come to you in this phase of, as the first kind of salvo on this round of our conversation. African agency is one that we talk a lot about. Between you and Shigeki, you've talked about the shift, you've talked about partnership, you've talked about this engagement and ownership. How is Africa engaging? Is there a real African agency in this engagement? Japan may mean well, as Amit just said. How do we translate that to the reality. And this is not just about TICAD. I was in Nairobi a couple years ago at the Mo Ibrahim conference when the president of Kenya, William Ruto, said, "We are tired of being invited and summoned to all kinds of summits around the world. Henceforth, we'll send 2 representatives from the African Union, and that will be it." But then a little bit after that, Italy, with Giorgia Meloni, hosted the summit, and all the African leaders went to Rome to do this. They went to Italy to do this. So where is the agency here? Can you really have the agency when you don't have the means to propel yourself to that table and it's initiated by somebody else?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I think the point that was made by Amit about how Africa now is central to the interests of so many major powers, or the major powers, and so many other parts of regions of the globe. I think that that's an important starting point. So the question is, how can Africa leverage that? How can Africa leverage the economic as well as the political interests that there is increasingly? African agency has been expressed, I think, in the Japan-Africa relationship through the TICAD process. So over time, one can trace a stronger African voice coming through in setting the agenda of TICAD, also in the kinds of statements that are made post the TICAD. So there has been an increasing responsiveness to African interest. And for me, the current Yokohama Declaration coming out of TICAD 9 carries quite a healthy dosage of African voice and African interests. So I think there are ways in which African governments and leaders find opportunities to express Africa's interests. On the other hand, when it comes to the things that really matters, when it comes to matters of economy, then probably we do not have that same kind of leverage. Japan, for example, has been the Japanese government has been advocating for greater private sector engagement, for more investments from Japan. But as a portion of Japan's global trade and Japan's global FDI, Africa captures a very small portion of that, not even 3 or 4%. So clearly there isn't enough commitment from the Japanese private sector to follow up on the declarations. There's risk aversion also for the African investment environment. And then lastly, I want to say that Africa should also, if Africa wants to capitalize on the current zeitgeist, then it should find a way to leverage its strategic resources on its own terms.
One element I want to follow up on, Scarlett, is governance. We heard you mention governance. Shigeki mentioned governance. Amit didn't mention it, but he was embedded in some of his comments there. Governance has been a serious problem in Africa. And by governance here, I mean mismanagement of resources and of the social contract. How does this factor in this issue of African agency? Are the leaders speaking for their people as they go to the summit, or are they leveraging the summit for their own benefit?
Yeah, good governance is critical to realize all of the economic ambitions that we are setting with our engagement, through our engagement with the rest of the world. And unfortunately, there is a democratic deficit on the African continent. There has been some progress, some political changes that had taken place in parts of the African continent. Unfortunately, at the moment, there seems to be a reversal of the positive progress that had been made, and that is a risk factor, not only for the continent but also for the other powers the powers that engage with the continent.
I'll shift here, go to Amit before we go back to Shigeki. Amit, There are a lot of talks about the African Continental Free Trade Area Initiative, intra-African trade. This, to me, feels like a pie in the sky, but I know most people believe in this. A lot of people believe in this. Following up on Scarlett's point about governance, or the lack thereof, good governance, that is, there is some kind of governance. It's not always the good governance that the people expect for the social contract to work. Where do you see the challenges with this? How do we tap into the African Continental Free Trade Area initiative within the bigger context of TICAD and the engagement and the forward thinking that may be there?
Okay, first of all, let me be an advocate and take this from a contrarian point of view. I believe that African countries, when we talk about good governance, I think there is an excessive demand made from Africa that is not made from countries in Asia, for example. Is good governance only something that Africa should do? If you look at how Southeast Asia and countries in Asia have developed over time, did they have the necessary prerequisite of good governance before they got on to the bandwagon of growth? They didn't. Some of the fastest growing countries in Asia have done that despite an environment of nepotism, corruption, and graft. And this has happened. I believe that much of the problems that Africa faces is not necessarily of their own making, but of the way the global financial architecture exists. And in that global financial architecture, for example, the cost of finance for African countries is a lot more than what it is for other countries in the world with more or less equivalent per capita income and level of development. But I will answer your question on AFCFTA first. So in March 2018, African countries signed this landmark agreement, which commits them to remove tariffs on 90% of the goods to be gradually liberalized in both trade and services. This is probably the most ambitious single market experiment carried out anywhere. It is even more ambitious than the one that the European Union has done. So we must support Africa in this endeavor. It may seem like a pie in the sky, but this momentum has only just started. So let's give them a little bit more time. But look at some of the big developments that have happened in such a short span of time. And this happened despite COVID coming into play. One is the Africa Continental Free Trade Area's Guided Trade Initiatives. That has 8 countries and about 96 products. Some pilots have already been carried out. And for the first time ever, African goods have been traded with preferential duties across the border with simplified documents. Yes, it's at the pilot stage, but let's give more time for other countries to join in and move forward. This is also, they've also been able to demonstrate trade in digital service. So these are great opportunities for African firms who are interested in growing their market within the continent to gain experience. The second is the Pan-African Payments and Settlement System. It's a centralized financial market infrastructure which allows for cross-border movement of payment settlement in local currencies. So for the first time, using PAPs, users can make near instant payments to each other within 120 seconds without using hard currency. So imagine this is something that not even other Asian countries have managed to pull off, and yet Africa has done that. So these are the 2 things that we need to watch out for, and look at the number of countries and the central banks that have signed up on the PAPs. So I am very positive at the trajectory of travel for AFCFTA. It might take longer than the deadlines that they've set for themselves. But look, elimination of 90% tariff lines by 2025. That's absolutely an amazing goal. Elimination of non-tariff barriers. Next, implementation of trade facilitation measures by cutting trade costs. So if Africa is able to achieve this, I'm sure they would be able to ensure to sustain the growth that they hope to address.
I do appreciate your bullish perspective, Amit, but I think there's an element that we cannot discount here. Is Africa is a constant target of the interests of others in a way that affected, it's been that way for 500 years. So the need for governance, while it can be overstated, cannot be ignored, because in order for Africa to fend for itself, because eventually Africa has to protect itself from all these interests that are not always in the interest of Africa, if I say so. That's where I think, as an Africanist in my case, I think the time is not on the side of Africa. Africa cannot wait. Africa is not isolated. So they need to come up quickly with modalities of governance that work. It's the spirit in which I'm saying it. Shigeki, you mentioned the Indian Ocean Africa Economic Zone Initiative. Asia is obviously present in Africa already, since we're talking about Asian undercurrent in Africa. Communities of Indians who had come to East Africa, particularly big businesses. China is of late. We heard from Scarlett, Japan has been engaging consistently since the mid-60s. How is this economic zone different? How do you see it, and what is there for the Africans?
Thank you. It's very interesting. And then coming from a fellow panelist, I think this is a good time we really start to consider changing the narrative for Africa development. Rather than focusing on perpetually addressing poverty, perpetually addressing issues, we should be coming up with our own development vision, Africa's Vision 2063, and then think about opportunities, potentials, talents we need to have. And we need to start thinking of investment for our future, in a way, our business proposition to get things going for Africa in, like Professor said, more organized and consistent way. And I think even addressing some issues, it is better if we can grow the pie and create more room for investment and then addressing issue, rather than kind of perpetually trying to discuss zero-sum game. So like my panelists said, I think the great thing about Indian Ocean Economic Zone is also looking at the opportunities and value additions we can create for the Africa's development. And then, you know, as you said, there has been lots of exchanges. But in the course of development, I do not think the Indian Ocean or economies around the ocean has been so much explored, except for Asian experience, like ASEAN, TPP, and all those things. Now, and also Asia, wearing Japanese hat maybe, Japan has invested so much in Southeast Asian countries, build institutions, build human resources, invest a lot. So actually, even for Japan-Africa relationship, doesn't have to be only Africa and Japan. Actually, it would make probably better business sense, even for Japan, to encourage Asia to even do better and closer business with Africa. And looking at Indian Ocean, I think the economic case of Indian Ocean has not been holistically and systematically explored. But we know the reality is that Africa is intrinsically connected economically with Asia. And leaders know that. That's why they are going that way, to make our case on our own terms rather than just waiting for other people to come and try to invest. So I can see so much potentials for collaboration during COVID-19. The first vaccine I got came from India. We have Tanzania agreed with India to establish a system for settlement without US dollars. The Tanzania agreed with Indonesia to promote business relationship. Prime Minister went to Japan for what? huge business delegation, we are entering into a time where we can really discuss win-win collaboration in socio-economic areas. So it is no longer about those who are helping, those who are helped, but it is about win-win relationship. And when kind of we look at the political construct and geographical construct, then we also should look at socioeconomic construct, which is actually already going beyond the border and even beyond African continent. So how can we continue to build Africa's capacity so that Africa can start to drive the positive narrative, focusing on investment in opportunities, possibilities, talents and skills and human resources? I think that's going to be the key in making this equal relationship work, talking about economic development driven socioeconomic transformation. I'll stop there.
Very good, very good. I'll come back to you, Scarlett, on technology. You mentioned the huge potential and reality, actually, it's no longer potential, it's reality of African demographics, but that comes with opportunities and challenges as well. One area where Africa has started showing tremendous creativity, since we're talking about co-creating innovative solutions here, is technology. M-Pesa, the money transfer platforms, which was actually Kenya-based, right? Kenya was the forefront of this. How does AI and robotics affect us in this space? What are the opportunities there, particularly as we hope to transfer technology and knowledge to this youth, who, by the way, are very digitally savvy? They may be living in poor countries. That doesn't mean they're not connected to the world. They're very connected to the world. And there's something that is missing. Where do you see technology, AI, and so on being a change maker?
Yes, I would like to start off by saying that if we are going to harness Africa's potential, it will have to be through its youth. If we are going to see the kind of growth that we want on the African continent, it will have to be through its youth. Technology is very important, yes, and with the advances that we are now seeing in robotics, AI, Japan is one example of a country that's leading in this kind of technology, and so knowledge sharing would be quite important. But then also we should pay attention to the digital gap, and the digital gap, which is a very important reality on the African continent, globally as well, but also especially on the African continent. So we have to back up any kind of investment in human capital development with hard infrastructure that should undergird any effort. So investment in digital infrastructure and other kinds of infrastructure that technology actually needs in order to flourish. So this is something that Japan, as one of the external powers, other external powers also certainly need to be engaged on for taking Africa's growth potential forward through technology.
Technology will be a major game changer, and there's no circumventing it. I'm glad every time I travel to the continent, you see the youth using technology in ways that should send a strong message. We just saw, of course, technology triggering tremendous backlash in Nepal, and the world is not divided. We're all integrated. We've seen Nepal be one extreme, but we've seen African youth mobilize through various movements, hashtag, and they all have hashtag names, which signal the technology basis of this, hashtag fees must fall, roads must fall, and SARS in Nigeria, Ballet Citoyen, and so on. This brings us to the issues of peace and stability. Japan is a pacifist country, at least their constitution says so. But the tremendous needs of accompanying Africa as Africa tried to solve its peace and security issues. We have hot zones in Eastern DRC, we have Central African Republic, the Sahel, and so on. Where does TICAD fit in this? Shigeki, to your point earlier, you cannot just say Japan. Bangladesh is heavily engaged in UN peacekeeping operations. So is India. So is Pakistan. These are heavy lifters when it comes to these configurations that we're talking about. Where does this come into being? Since you are with UNDP, I'll defer to you and maybe take a little less of your diplomatic hat and more of an analyst hat. And then after that, we go to Amit to react to those two questions. And then we can open it for the audience.
Comment on the peace and security?
Yes, please.
Okay. And use, probably. Although I tend to think that the best solution for best prevention, conflict prevention is socioeconomic development. Let me put it aside. But, first of all, really, Africa has been a key player in international peace and security. It has been a major contributor to all PKO operations run by UN. And that's the reason why I think UNDP, working with Japan, actually since I joined UNDP probably 20 years ago, we've been really supporting African peacekeeping centers. And what they have done to build the capacity of Africa, not only to contribute to their own peace, but really contribute, maybe through UN, to peace and stability of those countries, even outside of Africa, is actually remarkable. And then, talking about youth too, another important thing I think they have done is really to create network of African professionals to work on peace and security. So I think the Japanese investment, in a way, in African networks and their own capacity development, I think has been very much appreciated by so many peacekeeping centers I worked with. Separately from that, youth as well. You mentioned youth as potential, in a way, destabilizer. Yes, I think it's about a half cup full and half cup empty. In a way, they could be the driver and they will be shaping the future of Africa. Even in Tanzania, like 75% of the population under 35. They need to be, I think one of the things we can do with Africa is to connect them better. Because if they're isolated and only fed the information by digital means, there's no way they can compare notes. There's no way they can undertake informed discussion. There's no way they can find other young people who are really interested in, for example, driving business, innovation, all those creative things. So, for example, what UNDP has been doing is really, one, innovation. We established so-called Timbuktu program, which is actually connecting innovation centers all over Africa. And it is now covering 2/3 of Africa. It is a hub for universities, talking about youth, to really challenge them in coming up with concrete solutions and opportunities to benefit Africa's future. We worked with Rwanda, I think, in ramping up Youth Connect Africa network that is now AU's official platform for youth. It is really like a TICAD by Africa for Africa's young people. We meet in Rwanda this year. We're going to meet in Antananarivo. It is remarkable, if you go, how initiatives they are taking to pursue their own agenda, culture, innovation, science, maybe all those areas, maybe medicine, maybe music, whatever the area of interest, we are creating a forum for youth to be connected and do something different for their own future. So talking PKO and youth, I think the important thing is really to create a platform, create opportunities, and help them to connect better to build their capacity of Africa, for the future of Africa. Over to you.
Thank you, Shigeki. Amit, if you can take 2 minutes and no more, so we can open it for our audience to react to both Scarlett and Shigeki's reaction to the points that I'd raised to them.
Sure. So let me address first Shigeki's point about security. I mean, I understand, Japan does traditionally has shied away from engaging in any security-related, kept it low profile. approach to its relationship with Africa, but it does have a maritime assistance framework in the Indian Ocean, which allows for capacity building and provision of some military hardware provision. Japan also has, I believe, a facility in Djibouti, which allows for coastal surveillance. And at some stage, the Japanese Navy has cooperated with the Indian Navy to undertake anti-piracy operations off the coast of Somalia. But really, in the long run, I agree, the answer to security is jobs, jobs, and jobs. And to create those things, you need finance. I think this is where Japan can make the biggest difference. It can help African countries reduce their cost of finance. Typically Africa pays 4 times more for borrowing than US does, and 8 times more than some of the most wealthiest European countries. That's an unfair level playing field. It's not a level playing field. Companies in Africa incur 18% higher interest rates versus 4% in high-income countries. How are they going to create jobs? This high cost of borrowing pushes them into a debt trap. Japan can help reduce those costs of finance. And why not? Why just Japan? Other Asian countries can do that too. In 2 ways. First, recapitalization of homegrown financial institutions such as the AFDB, where incidentally Japan has a 5.5% stake. It's laudable that Japan has made a massive 14.5 billion commitment to enhance private sector assistance, which is to encourage the growth of small and medium enterprises. These are the ones that will absorb the excess workforce. The other thing that Japan can do in terms of security is, of course, policing and maritime security. A lot of the coastal African countries are unable to make use of their blue economy, which is essentially the coastal communities, because they can't monitor their sea lanes. Their fishing, the fishing reserves are taken up by trawlers which belong to other countries. If Japan can do that, so can other Asian countries. So it will require a Herculean effort, but the Africans, if the African governments are in the driver's seat, the commitment to creating more jobs exists, then we can address the question of security in the long run. Africa is also becoming a center for global terrorism. Even as we speak, a lot of the former IS operatives from the Middle East have started to converge in North Africa, and this presents a real security issues. Improving surveillance and intelligence. These are some practical efforts that can be made in that direction.
Thank you to the 3 of you. I have a question that I want to pose to you. I want to direct this question to each one of you separately. 3 questions to each of you to answer. So the first one is, given Africa's vulnerability to climate change, what innovative Asia-Africa partnerships can be fostered to scale climate-smart agriculture, renewable energy, and carbon credit opportunity for sustainable development? Amit, I'll give you that question. There's another question for Scarlett here. Youth-led organizations in Africa are often rich in creativity, but limited in access to capital, networks, and policy-making spaces. From your perspective, what models of Africa-Asia or Asia-Africa collaboration can ensure that young innovators are not only beneficiaries, but also co-creators in shaping sustainable development solutions? This is actually where the recurrent questions. And then there's a question from Nigeria here, and this for Shigeki. What will be immediate remedies and, more importantly, long-term sustainable remedies to the trust deficit between Africans and their leaders as you try to co-create solutions that will address the pertinent questions of how to expand public-private partnership, private sector investment, particularly industrial development. So this is, so if you guys can take no more than 1 minute or 1 to 2 minutes to answer this, so we have time for everyone, and see if there are any more questions coming after that. Amit, I'll start with you.
Thank you. Yes, absolutely. Africa, really has a veritable booty of natural diversity. It has the second largest rainforest cover in the world, some of the longest stretches of mangroves and peatlands. These are ecosystems that are natural buffers. They're the last natural buffers left in our arsenal to fight climate change. But there is a cruel irony here. Although Africa contributes only 3.8% to the global greenhouse emissions, it bears the worst effect of climate change. Africa will see 20% drop in rainfall by 2030. Crop yields in Africa are projected to decline by 10% in the next 30 years. So you can imagine what this would do to the food systems. But if Africa can counter these negative consequences, it needs at least $12 billion a year in climate finance. And that becomes incumbent on those who have that to deliver it in a way that makes it meaningful. So what is Singapore doing in this? I'll just give you an example. The global carbon market has mobilized over $5 billion in finance through carbon credits. Singapore has started to impose carbon tax on some of its most polluting companies. But in an attempt to encourage them to offset some of those taxes, it has tried to create a new implementation agreement under Article 6 of the Paris Agreement with Rwanda. It has signed with Rwanda and Ghana, which will allow project developers based out of Singapore to create green diversity projects. And in return, hopefully that will raise finance for those projects. The problem here is that a lot of that development will end up going into the accounts of project developers that are not in Africa. And this is where we need a lot more African agency to come into play. If there are more African players who can develop carbon credit projects or carbon sequestration schemes, that will allow finance to flow into Africa. If African countries can create a much more, shall I say, robust carbon credit exchanges which are robust, which have the right regulations, then they can start an entirely new industry which will create a lot more jobs. So these are some of the ways that I believe the carbon market can channel more finance and create more jobs in Africa. It's easier said than done. It'll take a lot more capacity building on the side of many African countries.
Thank you. Scarlett, on the youth-led organizations in Africa, the question was pretty extensive there. 2 minutes to you.
Right. So I'll address that question by talking to the point of what's international support mechanisms had been created within an Asia-Africa context, trying to harness and exploit the potential that lies in Africa's youth. So out of TICAD 8, for example, which was held in Tunis 3 years ago, the Japanese government announced Japan's Green Growth Initiative for Africa, which isn't specifically focused on the youth only, but on helping African economies to decarbonize. But then more concretely was also in TICAD 8 an announcement by the Japanese private sector, a 10 billion yen investment fund for startups, and that is specifically aimed at providing the capital for startup businesses on the African continent. Then out of TICAD 9, the Yokohama Declaration for the first time speaks quite focusedly about supporting or having private sector engagement with Africa, but at the level of small, medium and micro enterprises. So the Japanese model usually is where you've got the big businesses, the big multinational corporations that pioneer the investments into Africa. But now there's a shift in focus to small, medium, and micro enterprises. And I suppose also that would mean harnessing the potential in indigenous enterprises and companies in Africa. There are a few other examples. JICA has a Ninja program. JETRO also has a similar scheme. JETRO is the Japan External Trade Organization, JICA, the Japan International Cooperation Agency, where these schemes are basically trying to connect venture capitalists and their finances to SMEs and startups in bioinnovation, agri-technology, and so on. So these all do exist. They should just be tapped into. I would end off, if I have Chair, if I have my last 30 seconds, just to say that we've spoken about the role of diplomacy. We've spoken about the role of diplomacy in all of the issues that face Africa. What stood out for me out of TICAD 9 was the broad-based stakeholder platform that it actually was. You had convening of academia, universities, convening of business, convening of civil society, and then along with the diplomats. So I think this kind of multi-stakeholder approach that we had seen being concretized through different presences of different stakeholders at TICAD 9 is a step in the right direction. And for the youth to tap into all of these would also be important.
Thank you, Scarlett. And part of my questions here, just as I look at this TICAD and Asia engagement with Africa, Africa's youth is rising in numbers, in creativity, and so on. A country like Japan is obviously well advanced technologically in many other ways, but the population there is on a decline. So you wonder, who are the counterpart to the African youth in Japan, in places like Japan? When we engage, I think 1,600 Africans lately got their masters from different universities in Japan, courtesy of JICA and other programs there. But if there's a decline of youth on the other side, what does it mean for African youth as they try to engage with the counterpart in Japan or other parts of Asia? This is a problem, of course, we see in Europe as well. There's an entire policy of immigration that target the African youth. That fear is driven by all the people, but who are in these countries, not by the youth in those countries who are not interacting with their African counterparts. Not a question, I just want to put it out there. If anybody wants to pick on that, that would be great. But I think in order for youth we all were young at one point and we engage with our counterparts. If there's no counterpart to engage with, it's a challenge. We see this in Africa in government, where the youth in the society cannot engage with the counterpart in government because they're not there. So how do we bring these policies when the youth themselves are not at the table? Shigeki, back to your question about remedies.
Just kind of picking on you first, I went to this business expo TICAD 9, and what is the first corner everybody has to move through? Anime, cartoons, electric games, and sports, esports. And so, Japan's population is declining, but it still has seizable assets because there are still young people around. That not everybody is 65 years old. And that may be actually the great combination of plenty of energized and interested youth on Africa, which has increasing talents, untapped, and then lots of assets on the software and value-added industry. I think that could be a good marriage, not only Japan, but Europe as well. So you took a look at, Africa's talent base, youth as talent base. I think it could be very, very interesting business in the future. Talking about Japanese anime and manga and games and others. But going back to the peace, I do think that without peace, stability, and unity, you forget about economic development. And that's the reason why peace and stability is so important. How can we support and continue to invest in governance is so important, even when we talk about business and economic relationship. Not in cookie cutter way, as you mentioned in the past, like good governance should mean this, but in a way which reflects our history, tradition, and about culture and values, including traditional ways of governing ourselves in Africa. Modern government, traditional governance, I think they should go hand in hand with each other. So continued investment is very important. And then trust deficit. If we start to create that better linkage between our traditional values and more kind of administrative systems, and then we create transparency, we create more engagement, honest conversation, space, as well as better communication, and also kind of whole of society approach, talking about private sector and other stakeholders, then I think we will gradually, not overnight, but gradually start to increase our social capitals, including trust deficit. And in this case, I think there are lots of things we can do with digital and information technology. Lastly, PPP, it's again the same thing. Still, academia, private sector, government, in many countries, they're not really talking to each other. Education has to reflect what we really need when those kids goes out to the real society. Private sector has to tell the Ministry of Education what kind of people they need to get their companies going. Ministry has to tell private sector what kind of investment we're expecting from private sector to keep training people up, because education is not one-off. So really kind of creating more connection toward the future targets. In a way, changing the narrative, investing in opportunities, investing in potentials, investing in the future talents. And if we could bring more stakeholders on board with focused idea on what kind of opportunities, including jobs, we can create, maybe that's one way Africa can get things going faster and at scale. Over to you.
Thank you, Shigeki. Thank you very much. We're coming up on time here. So what I'd like to, there's one more question, but I will ask that you take only 30 seconds to answer it. Because we literally, we don't want to deny our audience that has been with us this time. One for you, Amit, is a middle income trap was mentioned, but how can Africa avoid it, especially with many Asian countries having fallen into it? This is from Japan. And then Scarlett, Africa is on the verge of missing out on AI, given that most LLMs are being trained with global north data. What practical steps can the young Africa tech survey generation take to steer this in the right direction to ensure that we don't have another 30 years of Africa blind AI? Coming from Kenya. And then to Shigeki, how can and what capacity is there for developing ASEAN countries to cooperate with developing African countries? That's from Thailand. So please, only 30 seconds so we can wrap this. Amit, we'll start with you.
So very quickly, yes, it is true that a lot of Asian countries have got themselves stuck in the middle income trap. And if you look closely, why that is so is because somewhere along the road of transformation, the important reforms that needed to be done as countries climb up that ladder of middle income were not placed. And this comes down to identifying areas where those countries should move towards, having a sight of the future. Those that have been able to do that invest in human capital, i.e. education, training, and mobilize capital have been able to break that middle income trap. Nonetheless, that's not the only thing. You would need a global environment to be benign to be able to do that. But I'll end my comment there. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Scarlett, 30 second, please. We
30
have only
seconds.
1 minute left.
So how to avoid an Africa blind AI world? It lies at two levels. It lies at the level of national policy making and where there's a concerted effort for real digital sovereignty alongside digital transformation and development on the African continent. Not all African governments are successful at the moment in formulating such policies and implementing it. Secondly, it lies at the level of, I think, what underlies or what's the foundation for technology, any kind of technology, and that is knowledge and science. If we are going to science, knowledge, and technology and innovation, if Africa is going to engage the world on its own terms, it needs robust science systems universities play a role there. Other stakeholders on the African continent also play a role there.
Thank you. Shigeki?
Okay, just headlines. One, Asia has growing private sector. Some of them are Japanese subsidiaries. Even Japan is going through Asia to come to Africa. So you have skills, technology, which are adapted to the realities of developing countries. And poverty has not been long in the past. So private sector may have really good practical skills and technologies. Number two, innovation. Again, practical innovation. There are lots of things Asia has developed which can be applied already in Africa. Very, very useful innovation based on your experience and knowledge. Number three, trade, investment, and finance. I think it's better we continue to strengthen our framework of getting trade, investment, finance going. It's already going a lot. But then if we can strengthen the system, I think that would be win-win. Lastly, sharing your development experience, because I think Asia is leading a little bit ahead of Africa. But I think from Africans' point of view, we are already seeing the back of Asia. So your experience will be very important to inform us what kind of things we need to avoid, but also what kind of things we can tap into. Over to you.
Thank you very much. This concludes our time. Actually, I'd like to just remind us that Africa and Asia cooperation is one that is present tremendous opportunities, of course, come with some risk. There is no shortcut to this. The fundamental of governance, we've heard, is important. The fundamentals of good economic policies remain important, but particularly the spirit of partnership that benefits everybody is key here. I'd like to mention that there is a post-webinar survey. If you're watching from the Nikkei channel or YouTube Live, please scroll down to find the link on the post to our post-webinar satisfaction survey. We'll really appreciate your input so we can do better in the spirit of Kaizen for next sessions. And also here we'd like to thank our hosts and our sponsors, Nikkei and the government of Japan. And for me, I'd like to thank our panelists, Amit Jain, who joined us from Singapore, Shigeki, who joined us from UNDP in Tanzania, and Scarlett Cornelissen, who joined us from South Africa. Thank you very much. It's our pleasure to discuss this important issue with you. This concludes our sessions.